I would like to welcome everyone to the final session of this class that we have had over 80 people join us for, and that's just on Zoom. We know that you're also watching on Facebook Live and Jerisha Live, and we're very glad to have you with us learning about King Solomon and his demons with Rabbi David Silber.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I start, I just wanted to thank Noah, who's been an excellent volunteer for us and really has done a lot of good work. Thank you so much for your work. It's really been very helpful and very good. Hope you continue to be helpful in the future, and thank you for all the good work you've done. Okay, so let us begin. Today's the last session of King Solomon and his demons. So last week we started a Gemara in Masechet Gittin, which I think is quite an amazing presentation. We didn't finish it though, so what I'd like to do is finish that Gemara, and then to look at just some of these Tanakh from the book of Melachim to end on a positive note and say something about Shlomo's building the temple and Shlomo's understanding of the temple, two different things. The story that we saw last week had to do with Shlomo's desire to get a hold of this shamir, which seems to be some kind of a worm that is able to cut through stone. Almost a magical kind of thing. And he's trying to find this thing. And what we saw last week was the ends that Shlomo will go to secure the shamir. And we spent all our time on that, pointing out that his behavior, his actions to secure the shamir are problematic in so many different ways. That's number one. But more than just being problematic, they, in a sense, are recalling some of the story of Shlomo that appears in the beginning of Melachim, which itself is problematic, and the Talmudic Agadah is, in a sense, playing off that. So, for example, to give one example, in the second chapter of Melachim, when David is dying, so he instructs his son Shlomo what to do in order to secure the throne. And two of the things he tells him specifically are to kill Yoav, who was David's main general throughout his life, and also to kill somebody named Shimi ben Gera. Shimi ben Gera is one might say, the spokesperson for the tribe of Binyamin. And when David is fleeing Yerushalayim after the Avshalom rebellion, Shimi meets him on the way out and curses him. And David's men say to David, why should we let him do that? Let me go and kill him. David says, no. If he's cursing me, God tells him to curse me. Don't harm him. And then when he comes back to Yerushalayim, David returns. Again, Shimi appears. And again, they want to kill him. And David says, no, we're not going to kill him. And he swears to Shimi that he's not going to harm him. He swears to him. But the last thing David does is to instruct Shlomo that there's this fellow named Shimi ben Gera, cursed me with a terrible curse. I swore I wouldn't kill him, but you're wise. You'll figure out a way to kill him. And that's what does happen. Shlomo figures out a way to kill him without getting to the specifics of how. But I think anybody reading the story will ask the question, first of all, even if technically speaking, David hasn't violated the oath, he has certainly violated the spirit of the oath. And one might go even further and say that it's more than just the spirit. If I swear I'm not going to do something, presumably that means I won't do it myself, nor will I instruct anybody else to do it. So in short, the violation of the oath, which is a central feature of the book of Shmuel's discussion of David. But at the end of the day, the one who causes the oath to be violated is Shlomo. Shlomo's the one who has Shimi killed. Now, in the Agadah over here, the way he secures this shamir is he discovers that the shamir, he captures the demon, the king of the demons, Ashmodai, and the king of the demons says, I don't have the shamir, but the minister of the sea entrusts it to a duchifat. We'll get to the duchifat in a minute. And the duchifat guards the shamir. And in fact, the Gemara says he uses the shamir to cut the mountains and to make places habitable for people. He's busy making the world a habitable place, which the Gemara says elsewhere is a big mitzvah. That's what he does. And Shlomo, and he's sworn to the minister of the sea to return the shamir. And Shlomo maneuvers it in such a way that the duchifat fails to secure the shamir. He doesn't watch it properly. It's captured from him. After which point he goes and he kills himself, having violated the oath. So first of all, the story is problematic in the sense one might ask, is acquiring the shamir, does that justify violating an oath made in God's name? And secondly, it's interesting that the violation of the oath itself is something which is highly problematic in the kingship of David and also by extension Shlomo. So it's interesting always, and my larger point, and this may seem obvious to many of you, but believe me, it's not obvious in the university world, that these agadot don't live in a vacuum. They do go off in many of their own directions, that's for sure. But they're also using biblical text, and they're moving from there, and they're expanding, and they're interpreting, and they're inventing. But at its core, many of the agadot are rooted in the biblical text. So that, for example, what we've seen is that in the biblical text, Shlomo marries Paro's daughter. The Agadah talks about Paro's daughter, that he's partying with Paro's daughter all night. He's sleeping on the keys of the temple. He can't open the temple, etc., which is the Agadic view. But it's also true that you can find it within the biblical text. And just to make one last point about this particular Agadah talks about Ashmodai, who's the king of the demons. One might say a Satan, but in the biblical text, the Book of Kings talks about two people that are Shlomo's Satan. Two people that are the Satan, and they take refuge in the land of Egypt, no less. And so in the Agadah, we have a demon as a Satan. We have a kind of Satan in the Agadah, a non-human Satan. But the non-human Satan is simply a mirror image, one might say, of the human Satan. In any event, what we left to last week is Shlomo has finally secured the shamir, having done all kinds of things that I think we can say are highly problematic. And if we scroll down a lot more, let's see how far we got last time. We got to the point where Shlomo asks Ashmodai, what's so special about you? That's right here. Shlomo said to him, listen, he quotes a verse from the Torah. Why does the verse praise your abilities and powers over those of human beings? What's so special about you? So now this is where we got last week. I wanted to finish this. Then I'll take comments and questions or insights. And then we'll complete it with going back to the biblical text, Shlomo's prayer upon building the temple. And I wanted to try to tie that in with some of the Agadot that we have studied together. So Ashmodai says to him, Shekol shushilta minai, b'havli iskater. So Ashmodai says to Shlomo, take the chain. The chain has God's name on it. Take the chain, and that's engraved with God's name off me, and give me your ring with God's name engraved, and I'll show you my strength. So Shlomo does that. He takes off the chain, he gives him the ring, and Ashmodai swallows the ring, eats the ring, and he's so big. After he does this, he has one wing in the heavens and one wing on earth. So Ashmodai sort of spans heaven and earth. Remember that we saw earlier that he spends before Shlomo kidnaps him, he spends half his days in the Beit Midrash Shamala and half his days in the Beit Midrash Shamata. That's how he spends his time. Okay. So now he then throws Shlomo, Arba Mea Parsi, a great distance. He throws him away. At which point Shlomo says, and the Agadah quotes the verse from Kohelet, Ma'yitron lo adam b'chol amalo sheyamol tachat hashemesh. What is the profit is there for a person who toils under the sun? Okay. Now let's keep on scrolling down. Fine. Now the Gemara says, with regard to a different verse in the book of Kohelet, V'zeya chelki mikol amali. What is the meaning of the expression, V'zeya chelki mikol amali? So from the way the God is going to interpret this, what remains of my kingship is this. So Rav and Shmuel, who typically disagree with each other in the Talmud, in the halachic sections and the Agadic section, one says it refers to his coat, and one says to his staff. So they're discussing possibly two different aspects of kingship that Shlomo retains. In any event, but this is all that's left. I was once king of the world, right? Shlomo. The whole world is coming to see Shlomo, and now he's out. So it says Shlomo would go from door to door. He walks from one house to the next. And whenever he would go, he would say in the first verse in the book of Kohelet, Ani Shlomo, not the first verse, but the first chapter. Ani Shlomo, Hayiti Melech B'Yerushalayim. Ani Kohelet, actually. The book of Kohelet doesn't have the name Shlomo, but it has the name Kohelet. I'll come back to that later. The name Kohelet, which Kohelet was king over Jerusalem, and they're taking it to mean I once was king in Jerusalem. According to the Agada, which is not in the biblical text at all, but according to the Agada, Shlomo has lost the kingship. Shlomo goes into exile. So the Agada picks up the story. We have to get into the head of the Agada. He's no longer king. Who is the king? So Ashmodai is the king. Ashmodai takes his place. So when Shlomo arrives, I'll read the English. When Shlomo arrives at the Sanhedrin, the sages said, an imbecile does not fixate on one matter. In other words, if he's sort of lost his mind, he wouldn't just say one thing over and over again. So therefore, maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe this guy is actually Shlomo HaMelech. So now they're trying to figure out who is this person claiming to be the king. So so they asked Benayahu ben Yehoyada. They asked him, let me ask you something, Benayahu. He's sort of in the biblical text, he's Shlomo's hitman. In the book of Shmuel, he's one of David's warriors. He's in charge of the palace guard. So they asked him, is the king with you? Does the king require you to be with him? Right? Does the king require you to be with him? He says, no. Then they ask the queens, does the king come to you? In. Yes, the king comes with us. They sent a response to the queens, check his feet. So apparently the feet of the demons look different. So the queens they answer, he always wears socks. We can't tell. The Moke Ka'ati, he comes wearing socks. He covers up his feet. The queens continue discussing the king's behavior. Because he demands that they sleep with him when they are menstruating. And not only that, he demands that Bathsheba sleep with him. Bathsheba is Shlomo's mother. And once the Sanhedrin hears this, they say, this can't be Shlomo. This he wouldn't do. He may have 1,000 wives, but he's not going to get involved with Bathsheba. So they bring in Shlomo, and they give Shlomo a ring, and the ring has God's name on it. When Shlomo enters, Ashmodai sees him, Chazeh and Parach, and he runs away. Then the Gemara adds at the end, V'afilu hachi, even so, even though he fled, Shlomo was still afraid. As it is written, and now they quote a verse in Shirashirim. Hinei mitaso shel Shlomo, shishim giborim saviv lo migiborei Yisrael. Kulam achuzei cherev ulamdei milchama, ish chabo ayirecho mipachad balelot. The verse from the third chapter of Shirashirim. Solomon's bed was surrounded by 60 warriors, holding swords and trained in war, each one with his sword on his thigh, from fear in the night. An interesting verse. So this is the verse that they're quoting. Notice that in this Agadah, they quoted verses from Mishlei, they quoted verses from Kohelet, and they quote verse from Shirashirim. It ends with a verse from Shirashirim. These are the three books that are ascribed to Shlomo. So there's something going on. They're all talking the language of Shlomo, including Ashmodai. The first thing Ashmodai says when he comes back and he sees wine in his pit, he says, there's a pasuk in Mishlei, wine is problematic, but he can't withhold himself. And the Agada ends with the following disagreement. Rabbi and Shmuel. One said, Chadam HaMelech v'hedyot, v'chadam HaMelech v'hedyot u'melech. One of them says they disagree about Shlomo. One says he was a king, and then he was a hedyot, he was a commoner, and he never became a king again. Ashmodai threw him out, and he never returned. And the other opinion is what we have, reflected in our Agadah. He was a king, he was banished from the kingship, and he returned to become the king. Now, that's the end of the Agadah. Let me say two things over here, and then I'll stop and take comments and questions. What is actually going on here? And let me make one observation. Shlomo is thrown out of the kingship by Ashmodai. He's kicked out. But what's interesting is we don't know how long he's kicked out. Actually, according to one view here, either Rav or Shmuel, one of them said he was a king and he never returned to the kingship. He was a king and then a commoner and never became a king again. And that's the verse, Ani Kohelet Hayiti Melech. I Kohelet was once a king. That's how they're reading, midrashically reading the verse. So what was happening all the time he wasn't a king? A year, 3 years, 5 years. Who was the king? According to the Agadah, who was the king? Who's running the show? The answer is, the Agadic answer is Ashmodai. And here's the point I think we have to think about. Nobody knows. Nobody can tell the difference until they start investigating. If Shlomo doesn't show up, Ashmodai remains the king forever. Because at the end of the day, what the Agadah seems to be suggesting is that the king of Israel and the king of the demons are actually, you can't actually know which one is which. So there's something very interesting over here about Ashmodai, that what the Agadah is saying, apart from all the other critiques of Shlomo here, what it's saying is actually, in thinking about Shlomo through the eyes of this particular Agadah, we could see him as a kind of Ashmodai figure, as a kind of demonic figure, that the Satan actually, who's out to get Shlomo, one might say, is none other than a reflection of Shlomo himself. That's, I think, what this medrash is actually getting at. And I just wanted to say one more thing before I stop here for a moment and get to the part two. Last week, we came across this duchifat. So I and probably some other people, I think Judy also looked this up, and so did I. And someone commented last week that the duchifat is the national bird of Israel, believe it or not. That's a kind of a vote. And they determined that the duchifat should be the national bird of Israel. I might say that nowadays having a vote in Israel and determining anything is already a miracle. But it's a strange choice. The duchifat is a strange choice. For one thing, it's a bird in the Torah that is not kosher. The Torah lists the birds you're not allowed to eat. And the duchifat, and after the duchifat is the atalek, the bat, which we may not call a bird, but we classify it as a bird in the Torah. So it's a strange choice. But what is the duchifat? I was very curious because this translation said wild rooster. But when I looked up duchifat, I came with a different one, and I also looked at the translations. I know very little, I would say nothing about birds, but the translation I saw when I looked up duchifat in more than one place is a hoopoe, Hoopoe, and there's a picture of the hoopoe. And what was interesting was that the hoopoe, as you can see the picture here, very nice, the distinguishing feature of the hoopoe is the hoopoe's crest. Now, another word for crest in English is crown. So it struck me that the duchifat is the one appointed by the Sar of the Yam. And what's interesting is, and the duchifat, this bird with this crown, is busy making the world a habitable place. And I began to wonder about this Agadah, who brings in the duchifat, because essentially, if you think of it as the bird with the crown, okay, then what we have in the Agadah is we have the king with the crown, that's Shlomo. We have the demon wearing the crown, that's Ashmodai. And we have the bird, the crown part of nature, who also wears a crown. And perhaps this Agadah wants us to think about the relative behaviors of these three kings. The Duchifat probably comes out the best of the bunch. The Duchifat has an oath which it zealously tries to keep and spends its time trying to make the world a better place, a habitable place. The behavior of Shlomo is very nuanced. And yes, he's the builder of the temple, etc. But the description of him here, and in fact, the way he builds the temple is highly problematic. He builds the temple the way Pharaoh builds the storehouses in Egypt, the Orei Miskenot. And then you have Ashmodai, who seems to be a kind of Shlomo figure, a reflection of Shlomo, spends all his days studying Torah. He's very wise. He sits both in the earthly Beit Midrash and the heavenly Beit Midrash. So apart from the actual text of the Agadah, which I thought was very interesting, I also wonder about the characters that the Agadah marshals to tell its story. And if the Duchifat is actually part of the story here, not just that we caused this animal to violate its oath, and then which leads to his death, but I wonder about the idea of the king in general, whether at the core of the Agadah is something about kingship in general, and specifically the human king in the form of Shlomo. So let me stop here for a moment and take comments or questions. Everybody's welcome to speak up.
I would like to add something.
Yes?
In case you wonder what was the end of Ashmedai. So according to very ancient Ashkenazi tradition, I mean, we have a manuscript for this. Ashmedai was killed in the pogroms of the First Crusade. He tried to stop the pogroms to save the Jews, but he was killed. So this was the 1096?
Yes.
So from then on, we don't have to worry about him anymore.
I see. Right. So that's an interesting tradition about Ashmodai, which I think fits fairly well into he's represented here. He's a demon, but he seems to be rather
Rabbi Silber is
demon.
the king. He's the king of the demons.
He's the king of the demons. He's the king of the demons, the same way Shlomo is the king he's the earthly king, and Ashmodai is the kind of heavenly king, but he's also on earth. He lives in both places. He's on heaven and he's in earth, which may mean he's in neither place, but the representation of him, I think, is, he's very wise, and that the stories that we didn't get into, the four things that he sees, which are very interesting. He understands the way the world works and the way the world should work. So that's he's very Solomonic in that respect. And someone sent me an email this week suggesting we could see Ashmodai as a kind of alter ego of Shlomo. And I think that probably is very much on point. I think that's the idea of this particular Agadah. Does someone else have something to say here?
I agree that Ashmodai is an avatar of Shlomo. It's so clear now. The first time I heard it last week, I thought this is cuckoo. And then thinking about it more and more and lining everything up, the Agadah, the Aggadist is using an alter ego to say what he wants to say about Shlomo, who debased himself in his activities. That's the king who becomes the commoner. And Rav says, and he never did teshuvah. He never came back. And Shmuel says, but he did do teshuvah in the end, and he didn't come back. A kind of Menashe kind of story.
Right. It's very. The position that he actually, because there's no evidence from, as far as I could see, from the Bible that he loses the kingship. On the contrary, he retains it during his lifetime. But this idea that the Agadah suggests that actually he's banished from the kingship. I find this a striking one. It's so it's the other interesting thing about this Agadah, which we didn't get into, is this idea of the seal. Each one has a seal, which was also very striking. Ashmedai seals up his bar, he seals up his pit, and Shlomo has the seal. And the way Shlomo uses God's name in order to capture Ashmedai, which I think is also problematic. I think that the Agadah sees that as using God's name to secure the Shamir, which is unclear in the first place whether it's actually needed. Shlomo wants to be excessively righteous, but so the whole thing is, I think, quite amazing. Yes, someone else has something to say? Yes.
Is it possible that the Duchifat is also another aspect of Shlomo? It's the pure part that truly wants to build the Beit HaMikdash, but he doesn't succeed because the other aspects of him, the Ashmedai and the power king, take over. But it's the pure Shlomo represented.
Could be, because the truth of the matter is that Shlomo, in his name of Shlomo, certainly suggests this. Shlomo has two significances. One is peace. There's no wars in his lifetime. There's no foreign enemies. All the other nations are at peace with Shlomo. And the other idea of Shalem, which is completion. He is the completion of David's kingship. He's the one. So one could certainly see it that way, that the Duchifat is the king who tries to make the world a habitable place. And then if you read it, as you suggest, it's a question about what the Agadah is saying, that within Shlomo's own person, there are these competing pieces of Shlomo. And this Agadah, I think, is, for the most part, has a somewhat negative view. But you could see this other king, the king who makes the world habitable, as once again, because Shlomo does do that. Under Shlomo, people living, it says, under their trees, and they're right under their trees, right? Tachat gafno, under their vines, and under their fig trees, and they're living in peace. So there is peace in Shlomo's kingdom, as described in the book of Melachim. By the same token, there's also conscription of people against their will, and there's building the temple through force and through power, and that's very power-like. So there's these competing elements, and I think what the Bavli in general tries to do, and thank you for that observation, I think the Bavli is not out to put holes in, to puncture, to burst out bubbles. The Bavli is after, for the most part, a nuanced reading of people and of situations. The Bavli is constructed around argumentation, about seeing the other point of view, and it wants to sort of fill out the picture. At the end of the day, Shlomo is a person, and one can have different takes on Shlomo. There is certainly, when it comes to Shlomo in the Bavli, some enormous critique. I mean, there's no question about it. By the same token, we shouldn't lose fact of the other side of it. He is the builder of the temple, and I wanted to end with that and say something about at least the biblical text, what it says about Shlomo as a temple builder. Okay, so that's the first part of what we have. If there are other comments or questions, I'll stop again. And if we don't get a chance in this last session, you can always send me an email at dsilber@drisha.org. I'm happy to try to respond. Okay, so I did want to say one thing about Shlomo, who builds the temple. David wanted to build the temple, and David is forbidden to build it for whatever reason. He himself says in the book of Chronicles, David says that I'm a man of war, and a man of war can't build the temple. Okay, and there may be other reasons as well in the book of Melachim or Shmuel that emerge, but that's not our topic. In any event, Shlomo builds the temple. And I wanted to make one observation about Shlomo's building of the temple, which also we have encountered in our reading of these various Agadot in the Bavli. And that is, we have to remember that Shlomo is the author of 3 books of the Bible. One is, of course, the book of Proverbs. One is the book of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet. And the third is Shirashirim. Now, whether we classify Shirashirim as a book of wisdom, it's an interesting question. The first 2 books, Kohelet and Mishlei, obviously fall into the category of what we call Jewish wisdom literature. Shirashirim would not appear to be wisdom literature, although there are some academics who believe that Shirashirim should be classified as wisdom literature, and one of whom, who I happen to have a lot of respect for, I'm talking to her about giving some classes at Drisha, perhaps before Rosh Hashanah, on Shirashirim that she's working on. She's taught before. She suggested to me that, I don't know what her own view is, but even Shirashirim could be called wisdom literature. I'll leave it up to her to discuss.
Who are you speaking about?
I'm talking about, who am I talking about?
Malka?
No. I'll come back to me now.
Okay.
But, and why I'm blocking on it subtly, but she's well-known person. I'll come back to me any moment. It doesn't matter. The point is, 2 of the 3 books are certainly wisdom literature. It's Adele Berlin. So the point is, so what actually personifies wisdom literature? What are some of the key elements of wisdom literature? So I'll mention one key element of wisdom literature. Wisdom literature, book like Mishle, book like Kohelet, they're not about specifically Jews, actually. The book of Eov is another example. The book of Eov, who is Eov? Is he even Jewish? There's no evidence he's a righteous man. But is he a righteous Jewish man or not? Who knows? Who knows? It doesn't seem to matter. The wisdom literature is addressing the human condition. So certainly Mishle and certainly Kohelet, and maybe Shirashirim, which addresses some basic, also the human condition from a different perspective. So Shlomo is the wisest of all. He's the greatest chacham who ever lived. He's wise to start with, and he's given almost a kind of divine supernatural wisdom. That's the story. So what I wanted to point out is the way this wisdom is reflected in Shlomo's building the temple. That's what I wanted to point out, and I'll take comments and questions, and we can stop at this point. So Shlomo, when he builds the temple, he completes the temple, and then he has a very, very long speech upon the building of the temple, one of the longest speeches in the whole Bible, which doesn't actually surprise us because everything he does is actually excessive. He has 1,000 wives, and when he builds the temple, he brings 1,000 sacrifices. So it's the same person. The same person who is excessive in one area is the same person who's excessive in a different area of life. And actually, so it's chapter 8, actually, of the book of Melachim begins with the following way. I'll read a couple of verses and then we'll jump to the main body of chapter 8. It's a very long chapter. But look at the way chapter 8 begins. Oz yakel Shlomo et ziknei Yisrael et kol roshei hamatot nisiei havot v'nei Yisrael el hamelech Shlomo Yerushalayim v'halot et Aron brit Hashem me'ir David hitzion. So Shlomo convenes or convokes, they say here, all of the elders of Israel, the tribes and the chieftains. And then it says, Vayikalu el hamelech Shlomo kol ish Yisrael, and all the people of Israel gathered before King Solomon at the feast in the month of Etanim, the 7th month. So right away in the first 2 verses, you have a verb that appears, and that the verb is kuf he lamed, or is yakel, vayikahalu. And without reading through the chapter, it appears several more times. And it struck me that the name of Shlomo that we have in the book of Ecclesiastes, we call it Kohelet. And Kohelet or Iti Melech, that the name Kohelet actually is coming right out of this chapter. He's the one who gathers people together, who brings people together. In the book of Kohelet is to reflect upon life, kind of meditation on life. And here he's gathering all the people to come to the temple. And he's going to celebrate with them the building of the temple. But what I would suggest is that it's not just he's celebrating the building of the temple, he's actually going to speak about what the temple means. And if, for example, you look, we jump ahead, for example, to verse number 22. In verse 22, and we have Shlomo's reflection upon the temple. And I would say not just reflection on the temple. What Shlomo does, actually, is he actually redefines what the temple means. Because up to this point, if you ask the question, what is the temple in the book of Shemot, the Mishkan? We just finished reading the book of Shemot, and it's finishing with it finishes with the building of the temple. The instructions to build them are there. Several chapters, 6 chapters of instructions, 6 chapters of building. That's how the book ends. And if we ask ourselves the question, what is the point of the sanctuary, of the Mishkan? What is its main purpose? Here I would say there are 2 main purposes, and the commentaries may be divided, which is primary and which is secondary, but they're both there. In the Torah, the Mishkan is the place from which God speaks, which God continues to command. And that's how it works in the Torah. God spoke at Sinai, and God continues to speak through the Mishkan and commands through the Mishkan. And that is the plain meaning of the Torah. That's not a midrash. That's the plain meaning of the Torah. The one who pushed that point, which to my view is the main point, but the one who pushed it is none other than the Ramban. And he makes this point in several places, that God continues to speak. Sinai is God speaks publicly, and the Mishkan is where God speaks much more privately. But in each case, it's God that's doing the speaking, and God is doing the commanding. And for the Ramban in general, this is the Ramban's view of the world. He tends to one might say privilege, as they say nowadays. He tends to put much more stock in that which is done privately than that which is done publicly. He talks about the hidden miracles of life and recognizing the hidden miracles. So for the Ramban, the Mishkan is the place from which God speaks, and God continues to command and to direct. That's one possible primary understanding of the Mishkan. And the other possibility of understanding the Mishkan, which doesn't contradict, certainly true, the Mishkan is the place in which you serve God. You bring sacrifices. The word that's used in the Torah is the word avodah, related to the word eved, a servant. It's where we serve. That God took us out of Egypt for the purpose of serving God, as God said explicitly to Moshe, to tell Paro, 3 words, Shalach ami v'yavduni. Moshe says it several times. Let my people go that they may serve me. And the place of service, or the primary place of service, which in the Chumash takes the form of sacrifice, is in fact the Mishkan, the temple. So these, I think, traditionally, when you look at the Bible, look at the Torah, these are the 2 different ways to understand the Mishkan. Now comes Shlomo, and he certainly does not negate the idea of sacrifices. He brought 1,000 sacrifices himself, but for Shlomo, that's not the primary idea of the Mikdash at all. It's certainly not the place in which God continues to speak. He doesn't mention that at all, actually. And sacrifices seem to be very secondary for Shlomo. Shlomo has a different take on the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash for Shlomo has a different purpose. But before we get to the purpose, he makes an observation that is not inconsistent with the Torah, but it's an important observation that he makes. If you look, for example, beginning in verse 22, again we have the Kahal. Vayamo Shlomo lifnei mizbach Hashem, neged kol kahal Yisrael, vayifros kapav hashamayim. So he raises his hands to heaven. Again, we have the Kahal. And he begins to speak to God. He says, O God of Israel, Eine kamocha Elohim bashamayim mimal v'al haaretz mitachat. There is no God like you in the heavens above and on the earth below. And then he continues. We can scroll down some more. I'm fulfilling the promises you made to my father David. He talks about that, right? Thank you for keeping the right. Now let's take this verse number 20 to 27. It's hard to read it. 27, I believe. Shlomo says, Ki ha'umnam yeshev Elohim al haaretz. Hinei hashamayim u'shmei hashamayim lo yichalkelucha af ki habayit hazeh asher baniti. Shlomo says, in truth, can God dwell on earth? Even the heavens, Shmei HaShamayim, the farthermost, uttermost reaches of heaven cannot contain you. How can this house that I built? This is coming from somebody who spent a lot of time building the house, a lot of other people's time too, and it is quite ornate by any standard. Everything he does is ornate. And after he spends 7 years building this house with all the gold and everything else, and all the hired help and all the conscriptions, he turns to God and says, you can't be contained in a house. The heavens can't contain you. How can, in fact, the house that I built contain you? And the next verse, he answers his own question. Ufanita el tfilat avdecha v'el tchinato Hashem Elohai l'shmoa el harina v'el tfila asher avdecha mitpalel lefanecha hayom. Verse number 28. So I'm going to repeat something that I've said in the past, basically because I like it very much. And I'll tell you what it is. What Shlomo is doing in verse 28, he's saying, I want you, God, to listen to my prayer. He calls his prayer El Arina V'El Tefillah, the cry and the prayer. And what's interesting is that in the Ashkenazic rite, at least, the Ashkenazim, so prior to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Ashkenazim recite Slichot, the penitential prayers. And the custom of the Ashkenazim, unlike the Edot Mizrach that started Rosh Chodesh Elul to say Slichot, the Ashkenazim start on the Saturday night, typically before Rosh Hashanah, or the previous Saturday night, depending on the calendar. And the highlight of the Slichot, first night of Slichot, is the so-called Pismon, the responsive prayer, the tagline of which is L'shmoa el harina v'el tefillah. Now, why did the Ashkenazic tradition choose that tagline for the first night of Slichot? And I believe the reason is because L'shmoa el harina v'el tefillah is what Shlomo asked God to do to his prayer. Shlomo stands before the congregation and prays to God. He wants God to listen to his prayer. But the point of God listening to his prayer is that this will set the stage for what Shlomo thinks the purpose of the temple is altogether. Because the purpose of the temple for Shlomo, and he makes this as clear as can be, is not sacrifice. The purpose of the temple for Shlomo is actually prayer. The temple is a collection point for prayers. You can go to the temple and pray, says Shlomo, but as we'll see in a moment, if you're not in the temple precincts, if you're far away, or if you're in exile, or even a foreign land, you pray via the temple. So what Shlomo is doing here is not just building the temple, he is redefining the temple. When the prophet Yeshayahu said, Beiti Beit Tefillah Yikarei L'chol Ha'amim, he was preceded by King Solomon. And what King Solomon is saying, when you dedicate something in the temple, one way to dedicate it is to use it for that purpose. So L'shmoa el harina v'el tefillah, one might say, is Solomon's dedication speech. Dedication in a narrow sense of dedication, that actually he's doing what he hopes the temple will be used for, which is a place of prayer. Because after all, God is not in the temple. God is in heaven, in the farthermost corners of heaven, but the God in heaven is willing to listen to the earthly prayers. So what Shlomo is doing over here, and this strikes me as very wise in the sense of wisdom literature. And as we'll see, there's some other aspects to this which are also very wisdom-like. So let's just scroll down some more and let's see what he says over here. He talks about, you will hear, right? Look at the next verse. V'shamat el tchinat avdecha v'amcha Yisrael asher yitpalalu el hamakom hazeh v'ata tishma el makom shiftecha el hashamayim v'shamata v'salachta. He talks about himself, your servant me, my prayer, and then he adds, and your people Israel. They will offer prayer towards this place. And you listen, God, in your heavenly abode. God's not in this building. God's in heaven. Give heed and pardon. The tradition that we have, which is found also in the book of Daniel, in Daniel, to pray facing the temple. We actually don't, we think of it praying facing Jerusalem, but it's really not Jerusalem. We do face Shirashirim. But what about if you're in Jerusalem? Or what about if you're living someplace else? I once visited my sister, who lives in the Gush. I said, which way is east, Ruthie? She says, no, you don't face east. You face north here. You're facing, if you're in Jerusalem, you face the Holy of Holies. If you're in the temple, you face the Holy of Holies. So you pray towards the temple, actually. And Jerusalem itself is a quasi-temple. But the heart and soul of the temple, the Holy of Holies, that's the direction that you face. And from there, the prayers ascend to the God who's in heaven. In the words of Shlomo, V'yata tishma hashamayim. And if you look at this long chapter, when he talks about prayer, you'll see over and over and over again, he has that expression, V'yata tishma hashamayim. I'm not going to go through every example of it, but it is clear throughout. Let's just scroll down a little more. He gives different examples of people. Look at the next one, for example, verse 33. When Israel is routed by their enemy, right? So they're far away, right? They will return to you. They routed because they sinned. They will turn back to you. They will acknowledge Hodu es Shemecha. They will acknowledge your name. And they will pray Babayit Hazeh in this house. So here's a case where they come to the house to pray. But in the next examples, they don't have to be in the house at all, because the house is actually symbolic. It's nice to go there. The Torah speaks about going there 3 times a year or whatever, but you don't have to go there to pray. As long as you face the temple or have the temple in your consciousness, perhaps, that's good enough. Because after all, God isn't. Look at verse number 35. Let's say in a case where the heavens are shut up, there's no rain, right? Right? And they've strayed, there's no rain, right? And then he continues in 37, if there's a famine, right? He has all kinds of terrible things that could happen. Kol tfilot, to 38, kol tchina, asher tiyeh l'chol adam, l'chol amcha Yisrael, asher yerdun ish negel levavo, ufaras kapav el habayit hazeh. Here there's 2 interesting features. First of all, he talks about communal tragedies. Plague is a communal tragedy, as we know. But then he adds, Asher yedun ish negel levavo. But then there's personal. Everybody has their own personal afflictions. Every individual has, he talks about your people, Israel. We'll get to that also. And then he spreads his palms towards this house. There's no suggestion that you're actually in the house. And God will listen in the next verse, V'yata tishma shamayim, you will listen in your heaven, which is your abode, and you will forgive them. Okay? And then he continues, Ki ata yadata levadcha et levav kol b'nei ha'adam. God, you alone understand the hearts of all people. Right? God, you understand every person. And Shlomo makes this point, very much a wisdom speech, in verse number 41. Shlomo is explicit about this. V'gamel hanochri asher lo meyamcha Yisrael hu uba me'eretz v'chalcha l'man shemecha ki yishmun et shimcha hagadol. It's interesting. First of all, he includes the non-Jew. The temple is not a temple just for Jews, for Shlomo. It's a temple for all humanity. God is the creator of all. And notice something else about Shlomo's speech that's very interesting, because the idea he emphasizes, which is found in the Torah, is that the temple is the place in which God's name is there. In the words of the Chumash, Hamakom asher yivchar Hashem l'shakein shemo sham. Not that God is there. God's name is there. And Shlomo takes that very seriously. It's a representation of God. It's not God, because God cannot be contained. God is in the heavenly abode. The prayers are being listened to in heaven, Tishma Shamayim. But the name is there. And people will come from far and wide because they hear about your great name. Now, when you read that verse, you can't help but think about the book of Kings, about people coming far and wide to hear Shlomo's wisdom, including the Queen of Sheba. She's heard how wise he is. It's the idea that Shlomo is a magnet that attracts the world to hear about Shlomo's wisdom. But in this speech, actually, it's interesting that in this speech, it's not about Shlomo, not at all. It's about God. One might say that everybody sees God in their own image, perhaps. But here you have this person thinking about the temple as a place of prayer, and not a place of prayer only for Jews, but a place of prayer for the world. And actually, if you think about it, it's certainly far removed from any sense that you have in the Chumash, that the Mishkan is a place for the whole world. The Mishkan in the Chumash is deeply connected to this particular people that God has redeemed. That's not to say others can't join. It's not a club. It's not a closed club. But the Chumash doesn't suggest at all. In fact, the only righteous non-Jew, Yitro, Moses' beloved father-in-law, great person, religious person, he leaves before he leaves before the building of the temple. He leaves before the 10 Commandments. He's sent away by Yishalach Moshe et Chotno. So Shlomo is taking this in a very different direction. And I would say this is the wisdom side of Shlomo. This is the Shlomo who could write something like Kohelet and could write Mishlei and perhaps even Shirashirim. And he's seeing a much, much bigger picture of things. So I think in terms of the nuance over here, one might say that the book of Mulachim, and I think the Agadah as well, understands that there's two sides to Shlomo being, it's the old question, universalism versus particularism, which will be one of our themes in our summer kollel this summer. Because on one hand, we are members of the world. We are part of humanity. And anybody who didn't realize that a year ago should realize it now. The COVID virus is non-discriminatory. Affects everybody the same. It's an egalitarian virus, and you realize to what degree we are all human beings, we're all similar to each other. On the other hand, Israel feels it has a particular mission in this world. So we are part of the general world, but we have a particular mission, those who choose to be part of that mission. So in the case of Shlomo, on one hand, you have the man who marries 1,000 wives. And the book of Mulachim is clear, as is the Agadot, Hesiru et libo. They cause his heart to stray from God. That's clear in the Tanakh, it's clear in the Agadah. The Agadah likes to focus more on Pharaoh's daughter, but one doesn't contradict the other. And on the other hand, you have this person who sees very, very big picture and can see a world in which the entire world is coming to the temple to praise God and to pray, and who sees prayer as part of the human condition. So it's not about sacrifice, and who sees a God who understands every individual person, every person's personal afflictions. So I think here we have something, I think it's very beautiful, actually. But I think it's very much what the Agadot are picking up on when it comes to Shlomo, both the critique of Shlomo, but at the end of the day, he is the builder of the temple, and he is very wise. Whether he regains the kingship after Ashmodai or not is a good question, but the Agadah has a disagreement. The extent of the critique. Does he manage to come back from all this? Let me stop here and take comments. Then I have one final thought about what we've been studying. So if anybody has comments or questions now, then I have one last thought about Shlomo.
Shlomo is saying here what the Navi will say years and years later, the Haviotim el Beit Hashem, what we say on Yom Kippur several times during the davening.
Right. That's the messianic vision of Yeshayahu.
Yes, but it's for him, it's not messianic, it's tomorrow.
Well, Mashiach may come tomorrow, but that's the way. That was my point before. And Yeshayahu is very clear. I mean that it's For Yeshayahu, maybe unlike other prophets like Yechezkel. For Yeshayahu, it's going to be a different world, basically, and everybody can come. And the famous verse about the Saris, the eunuch who comes, and God says, "No, you have a place with me." Natati b'chamotai yad vashem. Told me better than children. Told me banot. You can be with me. I value you like everybody else. You can be very special to me. Shem olam etenu lo asher lo yikaret. You have a name. The name is so identified with the temple. So it's something which I think is, it's very powerful, and it's all here in Shlomo's in Shlomo's tefillah. It's all here. Yes, thank you for that comment.
Isn't it also possible that this beautiful prayer is a recognition of failure? Here he spent 7 years, an incredible amount of booty on building something that in the end it's just an abode. And in many ways, it's like the Duchifat, who really who has failed. Is not and in some ways he takes his wisdom and he turns it into something then that in the future you don't need the building. We turn towards it even when there's no building.
But you raise a very good question. I've wondered about this for many, many years, whether in the book of Melachim there is a critique of Shlomo's building the temple. I can never know for sure whether it's a critique or not, because on one hand, the biblical author seems to take a lot of pride in the building and the beauty of it. On the other hand, as you say, it's very ornate, and the Mishkan, it's very beautiful, but it's much more simple. It's a bunch of curtains. There's something about the excess and also the way it's built, of course. And you may be right. Whether Shlomo is aware of this or not, whether it's his recognition of his own failures, this I don't know. It's very hard to know. The text doesn't really psychoanalyze the characters, but I think the reader can say that the prayer presents the temple as a kind of, it's almost secondary. You can connect to God wherever God may be. And I did want to pick up on your point. I wanted to conclude with the following observation. This story of Shlomo, the 11 chapters essentially that deal with Shlomo, are embedded in the book of Melachim. The book of Melachim is about exile. It's a description of what happened. How did we end up in exile? So it talks about the division of the kingdom, and then the northern kingdom is exiled with the 10 tribes, and then in the end, the 2 remaining tribes, and the temple is destroyed, and the tribes are sent into exile. That's how the book ends, actually. And I was thinking that actually Shlomo's prayer actually gives us hope that part of this whole long chapter, which is very long and very long prayer, what Shlomo is suggesting is something that our tradition picked up and actually runs with. What Shlomo talks about in this chapter is praying via the temple, but actually later in the chapter, he goes beyond that. Praying via the temple, says Shlomo, and praying via the city that you have chosen, and praying via the land. And suddenly, actually, for a book that ends in exile, and the question that concerned the book of Melachim, I think, and certainly concerned our rabbinic tradition, without question, was after the temple is destroyed and Israel is in exile, can we still connect to God or not? Because you could argue, look, the temple's destroyed, that was our connection. God has broken faith with us. We broke faith with God. And what Shlomo suggests in his prayer is that actually the connection to God is not about a temple or space. I'm not suggesting that the land is not important or the temple is not important, but what Shlomo is saying at the end of the day, you want to connect to the God who's not actually here, because God's abode is in heaven. And that Shlomo's focus on God being in heaven, and you can pray to God via a space. You face the temple, whether it's there or not. You face the city, you face the land, is a way of saying that even if this particular connection is broken for a time, there is still a way to be connected to God and to hope for return. As we see in the book of Daniel, he goes out and he prays, he opens up his windows and he faces Jerusalem. Jews have been praying towards Jerusalem for thousands of years. It's already in Sefer Daniel, probably preceded it. So the point is that in this book of exile, I think what Shlomo's prayer does, more than just redefine the temple, is it gives us hope in the sense that we can always keep these connections, even if they have been severed in many ways because of exile. And Shlomo himself talks about exile and being distant and being far. You can't get to the temple. Maybe the temple is destroyed, but you could pray by the temple, through the temple. And the God who is in heaven, because God can't be contained, and the God who sees everything and connects to every individual person as well, can still hear prayer. So this is actually, it's interesting, you always come back to the same observation that as we Ashkenazim at least get into the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur mode, and we're going to be having a lot of prayers. Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur are days of prayer, but we start with Shlomo's prayer. L'shmo el arina v'alat tefillah. What Shlomo is saying is, I'm dedicating this temple not through sacrifice. I dedicate it through prayer. So I'll stop at this point, and I hope with this brief study that we had together of Shlomo, largely through the Midrash and through the Agadot, I think it helps cast more of a light upon Shlomo. There's more to be said, obviously, but we'll stop at this point. We do have some pre-Pesach classes. I'll let Noah describe those, and then after Pesach we will continue with other classes through the summer and hopefully next year as well. Thank you all for participating.